Well, hello everyone. I'm very excited today to be joined by Professor Jean-Paul Rosaye from the Universite d'Artois, where he is Professor of British Studies and History of Ideas. Professor Rosaye is an expert on British Idealism and has translated Bradley's Appearance and Reality into French. We're going to be discussing Appearance and Reality today, but we can't take on a whole book that's over 500 pages long. That'd be impossible. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to look at three key sections of the work that provide a good kind of way-in and overview of Bradley's metaphysics. And that's the introduction, then the introduction to the appendix that was published in the second edition, and chapter 15. Before we get going, and thank you very much, Professor Rosaye, for joining us, could you just start by giving us a little bit of background about the work and how it sort of fits in with Bradley's history and writings as a whole?
Yeah, so Appearance and Reality is, in fact, Bradley's fourth book. He started his philosophical career at the beginning of the 1870s. He published a first little book of around 70 pages in 1874, entitled The Presuppositions of Critical History. It was followed a few years later by the publication in 1876 of Ethical Studies. And then you had the third book, The Principles of Logic. The first edition of The Principles of Logic, published in 1883. And actually, Appearance and Reality is the fourth book. Regarding Appearance and Reality, in fact, there were many editions of the book. The first edition was published in 1893, but very quickly there was another edition. The second edition was published in 1897, and this is the edition that people generally use. Okay, because you have dense supplementary notes that were added to the first edition, and on top of that, an appendix, which is written in small type, but sometimes we say the small type is very important. And yes, indeed it is. So it's a much enlarged version. Bradley very rarely uses jargon. Most of his style is, very easy style. It's ordinary English. But sometimes, even with very simple words, you can get entangled in so very deep thinking. And sometimes you have to reread the sentences again and again, and you realize that you need to adopt a method to read Bradley in order to first of all, describe his thinking properly, even before you start, thinking it over, before you start criticizing what he says. The first thing you have to do is to understand very precisely what he's saying.
So let's turn to the first of the three sections you'd mentioned to help get a way in, and that would be the introduction to the book, which presumably was untouched from the first edition. That's not many pages. It's only 6 pages or so, isn't it? So what do you think what's Bradley trying to do there, and why is that important to understanding his work?
So the general introduction is very interesting because it provides Bradley's main idea about what is metaphysics important for. It starts with a very simple definition of metaphysics: to know reality against appearance, a study of first principles, to an effort to comprehend the universe. Okay, but then he moves on discussing three main objections. The first one, which is that in fact the first objection, the knowledge that the metaphysician tries to get is impossible to have. And so just gets rid with it very easily, saying that it is already a metaphysical position. The second one, which is that the knowledge we can draw from metaphysics is useless. To a certain point, he quite agrees with it, because in the preface to the first edition, he has these sentences that is very often quoted, and says that metaphysics is the finding of bad reasons for what we believe upon instinct. But to find these reasons is no less an instinct. There's something instinctual, So yes, but it's always the finding of bad reasons. So it would perhaps grant the second objection with some kind of grounding. Say yes, perhaps, but at the same time we can't help it. There it is, and he asks the reader to proceed with the book because, some further explanation is being provided. And then we have the last position, which is that the third objection, which is, in fact, we already have a great deal of metaphysical doctrines, metaphysical systems, so why do we need another one? Okay, and this is the point which in my opinion, is very important. Because what he says is, so I read from him, that is why lastly, existing philosophies cannot answer the purpose. For whether there is progress or not, at all events there is change. So I read a little bit below. Hence, there seems as much reason for new philosophy as there is for new poetry. This is to say that for obvious philosophical reasons that he explains later in the book, we must produce new metaphysical statements at regular intervals. As if we can use this, you see, there's this idea by Thomas Kuhn in his book, on the scientific revolutions. Sometimes we shift from one paradigm to the other, and therefore, obviously, we need another metaphysical doctrine that will exemplify this new paradigm. Okay, fair enough. In more Bradleyan terms, would say that the amount of thinking that is being produced in order to explain the universe at some stage doesn't quite square with the new ideas that will be provided. One of the great difficulties is that we live in a world that is changing all the time. I mean, this is the beginnings of philosophical thinking. Okay, we're confronted to a world which is changing incessantly, and so there is a moment when, in fact, we move from what Michel Foucault called an ideosphere to another ideosphere, and therefore we must produce new forms of judgment that will produce new metaphysical doctrines, new forms of understanding. And this is a necessity. Therefore, we must gradually write new philosophies. There is another more, let's say, more deeper level of understanding this point, which is, what about the ancient metaphysical doctrines then? The thing is that if we stick to the old metaphysical doctrines, there'll be a moment when obviously they'll be totally useless and meaningless. And being forced to maintain these metaphysical doctrines amount to mere dogmatism, amounts to mere orthodox statements that will be considered as no longer acceptable. So therefore, there is a necessity to move on. And this is a topic that Bradley has developed regularly in all his books until he managed to formulate this in a philosophical manner in Appearance and Reality. We have this in his first book on the presuppositions of critical history. This is critical history. And as he says, or as he wrote in his book, the historian is the main criterion for providing the historical reconstruction. Say it is a kind of mix of subjective elements, some objective elements, But this is a mix at any rate. And of course, the different testimonies that were produced at the time events had taken place are not also to be trusted 100% either. So that we realize that over the course of time, there's a need for constant readaptations, constant rectifications, constant productions on historical facts again. And there's this necessity of, providing this critical assessment all the time. His next book, Ethical Studies, did the same. Say what is necessary in Britain in the 1870s is we have schools of thought that obviously maintain a dogmatic and orthodox position. And we have to move on because they are no longer acceptable to deal with the universe as we know it today. And he has this sentence which is important. He says, we have to produce a philosophy to explain what the vulgar believe. Because in fact, the ancient schools of philosophy are no longer capable of explaining what the vulgar believe. And therefore, we need something new. And, well, Bradley at the time explained that Hegel had started to produce that kind of philosophical statement, and therefore that was the necessity to keep up to this new dimension. And in Appearance and Reality, Bradley states this again. Okay, we have to produce a new metaphysical statement, and it is fundamental.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. So how then, so a question I had when reading that and discussing things with you is that you can you might be able to see how, say, ethical questions need to be re-asked again as the context changes, technology changes, etc. And history as well, there's a certain amount of looking back in the past and we might reinterpret what happened or to make new discoveries. But maybe from a naive idea that might link metaphysics with the sciences, you might think, well, the metaphysical truths don't change. How the nature of reality doesn't change. All that might change is the language we use to explain it or the meaning of our words. So we might need to find better ways to describe reality, but reality itself doesn't change. And that would be maybe the conflict between the semantic or subjective elements in your metaphysics, but then the objective thing it's trying to get a hold of. Where do you think Bradley sits on that?
What perhaps is a solution to all that is to say that some metaphysical doctrines are more interesting to you than some others from the start. And therefore, you have metaphysical statement that would answer some personal preoccupations that would be yours, knowing that you can start from there and then produce your own update until you find satisfaction with it. And we'll see again later that this element of satisfaction is extremely important to provide a kind of value test of your metaphysical doctrine. So you can start from a metaphysical doctrine that seems to correspond to your thinking, and then, of course, readjust, rectify a certain number of elements. And I mean, today we still have Spinozists. We still have people who think that Plato provided, the right answer on the reality of the universe. You have Aristotelians. You have people of different persuasions. Okay, but the idea is, even a Spinozist today would perhaps produce a few rectifications in order to adopt the philosophy of Spinoza in our times. And I think that this is an idea. Bradley here has developed an idea that is very interesting because we can adapt it to our purposes. And it's never wrong. Because, of course, if we are dissatisfied with an idea, so we'll not entertain that idea for a very long time. At regular intervals, doctrines have to be updated to correspond to what people believe. I mean, it's a good point. And we'll see later that it corresponds to his own philosophy. Okay, especially his a subject-predicate metaphysical doctrine is just a metaphysical explanation of this principle.
I did a long chat with Dr. Martin Steenhagen on Collingwood's autobiography, and there seems to be there's a lot of talk there about every philosophical answer is sort of incomplete without the question that it's a reply to. And there seems something similar going on here. And obviously he was very influenced by Bradley. And there seems something going on here that's similar in that the metaphysics that we produce is in some ways an answer to the questions of our age. And it's going to be expressed or explained, or I think you'd mentioned you sort of starts off with the questions of our age, and we might try to grapple with those and answer those, and that will then slowly lead into a broader metaphysics that will always be different to the metaphysics of the past because they were concerned with different questions. They had different things that they were dealing with. And I'm certainly very sympathetic to this approach to metaphysics. And I think that it's largely what's missing from the metaphysics that I find in the analytic tradition, which is often quite sterile and concerned with what objects are in your domain of your logical system and these sorts of things. And that's a major thing that drew me to Bradley, was this idea to try to find answers that worked for you, for your age, and for the people around you. And actually, this work was written for you'd mentioned his simpler language in this book. But what I like about some of the metaphysical books of the past is they were understandable to a general audience. I mean, they at least attempted to be readable to intellectually curious but not professional philosophers. And I think that we need more of that these days. We need more philosophers in our cultural discourse, trying to make sense of where we're at.
Yeah, well, one point is that still in the 19th century, on the whole, ideas were culturally consequential because people read books, especially politicians, who had poetry, who had philosophy. Even sometimes some very important politicians were philosophers. Balfour, for example, was an idealist philosopher, and a few others also. I wouldn't go as far as to say that our politicians today read books. I'm not sure they do, but I don't want to turn this interview into a political discussion. No.
But they read newspapers and blogs.
yeah, probably. But yes, there's this dimension. You see, you can't get rid of the context. Bradley was writing in the late Victorian period, at a time when it was obvious that the new world, the new industrial civilization, wasn't only making progress, but was getting stabilized. And there was no way it was possible to go back to old and merry England. And you had a lot of people who were, when they were placed in that situation, they still mourned to a certain extent the old civilization. But anyway, Bradley was confronted to this new scientific world. He knew that science was effective, was capable of explaining a great deal of the universe. And to him, it was appearances. But he never said that appearances were of no use. He never said that appearances were useless. Actually, they're very important. These appearances are very important. The problem is that they're constantly shifting. So it's necessary to maintain a position to judge the movement of these appearances. There is a word that comes regularly in his book, which is the word makeshift. Okay, science is a makeshift. Technology is a makeshift. Fair enough, it works. It builds a world, it transforms the world, sure. But at the same time, it is as if we wanted to keep an eye on the evolution of all of this through time. So therefore, this metaphysical position is still fundamental. It means that it places us still in this position where we can produce a personal statement about how the universe is going, what is the kind of universe we're living in at any kind of time. So it is a kind of position which still enables us to provide the thinking that is necessary, to just to raise the head and look, further and not spend our time just following things the way they go. No, we need just to look around at some stage, and this is what the metaphysician does, from Bradley's perspective, I think.
Okay, yes. Great. Okay, thank you for that. So let's move on now then to the introduction to the appendix. So we've got an idea of his approach to metaphysics and why it's necessary. Now, this obviously was written after his book had been published, and it was in response to some criticisms of it. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but he sort of leaves the first edition untouched, doesn't he? And he just adds additional footnotes and the appendix to it. But the earlier bit is unchanged. So this is his whole attempt to make any kind of corrections is here, isn't it? And there are 10 points, and we're going to go through them, but not all of them in much detail.
Yes, there are 10 points, and basically Bradley attempts at clarifying some of his positions in the book. In these 10 parts, it provides some very simplified explanations. And of course, in order to get the detail, we have to get into the book itself. But we have this first clarification. We know now that he was in particular dissatisfied with his notion of immediate experience, his notion of feeling, which is perhaps the most important concept in the whole book. The first part deals precisely with that notion. Okay, I read, "It wasn't in my power to write a systematic treatise." And at the bottom of the first part, it says that again. "The want of system in my book is, however, another matter, and this I admit and regret." So, there's no system, he's aware of some deficiencies. Okay, that's the first point. If he had provided all what he wanted to say about feeling and immediate experience, perhaps he wouldn't have said so. But the absence of the system is important too, because it means that you can read the book the way you want, because there is no system. You can start, from chapter 17 and then jump to chapter 3, whatever. There is no system. But what is required, at least, is to get the main hypothesis and then to have the main solution to this hypothesis. Let's say to have a kind of core, fundamental statement from which you can start exploring the other chapters. So from part 1 already, we understand that it is his intention in this appendix to provide, this clarification in order to help the reader to start anywhere in the book. This is actually what he says. In the middle of part 1, you can read, "The arrangement of the book doesn't correspond to the order of my thoughts." And a little bit below, say, and they would say, depending on with which chapter you start, they would all have led to the same end. That's to say, the philosophy of the absolute anyway. So, therefore, what we are looking for is his starting point, his main reception, and this is what we have with the second part of the appendix. The actual starting point and basis of this work is an assumption about truth and reality. I have assumed that the object of metaphysics is to find a general view which will satisfy the intellect. And I have assumed that whatever succeeds in doing this is real and true, and that whatever fails is neither. So this agrees, one more time, to the principle that each new generation will need a new system for its own satisfaction. We see that the starting point is already present in General Introduction. Okay. And it's very often the case with Bradley. You realize that when, after he has dealt with metaphors, after he has dealt with these famous monologues, his, digressions and so on, he always comes back on his feet. Always deal with the same ideas at regular intervals. This is a specific feature of his book. So we've been through this idea already. The idea that satisfaction is a criterion for assessing philosophies, metaphysical doctrine, then this is something very important. In part 3, it comes right to the point and says, but with this we come against the great problem of the relation of thought to reality. Okay, this is the main problem he tried to question in his book. That is to say, we learn very quickly that thought is not reality. That is to say, whatever, the ideas that are produced by our minds, they're never real. And this reminded me of René Magritte's painting. You probably know, it is a painting on which you have a pipe, which is painted, and below the pipe you have the caption, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe." This is not a pipe. Of course, this is a representation of a pipe. This is not a real pipe. So all the ideas that are produced by thought are not real. And in fact, we live in the middle of the ideas. This is what he calls later, the ideality of the given fact that we have. We move into that kind of realm. We move in that kind of system where we have a lot of ideas, but the problem is that these ideas are not reality. And so therefore, there is, as he says, there is a dilemma. There's a dilemma. The dilemma is we produce a lot of thinking, but this thinking never squares with reality. So what can we do with this? Okay. And therefore, as he says, he is obliged to impose a notion, which is that there is an other of thought. And you have it at the bottom of the page a little bit later in part 3, when he says, thus reality appears to be an other different from truth, being, the whole statements that are produced by thinking and that seems to be in conformity with the ideality of the given facts that we have. Another different from truth and yet not able to be truly taken as different. We have another of thought. And here we have a difficulty. Because we can think that there is a possibility to position this other of thought as a kind of transcendent thing in itself. But of course, this is not the solution that Bradley will provide, and there is a difficulty with this. Okay, and as he says later, well, we indeed do something to solve it. So he tries to solve it by the identification of being or reality with experience. This is the solution he offers. Let's say instead of providing a transcendent thing in itself, it produces something that is imminent. It is transcendent in the sense that it goes beyond thought, but at the same time, it's forever present with us. So this is the other of thought is necessary. It is a necessary addition to the thinking process. So we can develop a metaphysical doctrine dealing with this, Aristotelian subject, predicate, property of truth, and so on. But at the same time, we have to provide something in addition to it. And this additional element is what he calls the absolute. This is this immediate experience, this kind of feeling that takes place at the same time. There is an important thing to mention here, which is that this kind of immanence is not the immanence of absolute truth. In fact, it never speaks of the absolute truth. It simply says the absolute. Okay, which means this is something which is not religious. Okay. And this combination of transcendence and immanence is devoid of any, say, non-religious kind of statement. So, as he says a little bit later, we're still in part 3. The solution of this dilemma offered in chapter 15 is, I believe, the only solution possible. It contains the main thesis of this work. So there we are. You see, the appendix provides the starting point, provides the dilemma, and offers one solution that, badly explains, is completely described and explained in chapter 15. This is the reason why I said that after reading the general introduction, after reading the introduction of the appendix, we'll have to have a look at chapter 15. And it means that once we're through with chapter 15, the idea is that we'll have the solution broadly provided for his metaphysical statement. And from then on, it will be possible to, explore the other chapters. So, in part 4 of this appendix, he gets a little bit deeper into the explanation of what this other of thought is like. Okay, it is where he gives the idea of the absolute. It starts at the beginning of part 4 with the solution of this problem. About truth comes the whole view of reality. Reality is above thought and above every partial aspect of being, but it includes them all. Okay, and this whole, each of these completes itself by uniting with the rest, and so makes the perfection of the whole. And this whole is experience. Nothing in the end is real except the absolute, and everything else is appearance. As long as you remain in the realm of thought, you are in appearance. But of course, when you reach the absolute, you are in the real. So, how is it possible to explain this? This is, what it tries to explain in the rest of part 4, and there is a further explanation in part 5. The word is supplementation. The remedy, say, why are we maintained in appearance, and how can we jump out of appearance to get into reality, is through supplementation. Can provide other words, which means that we have to supplement our thinking with more and more ideas that will be more in tune with the things we perceive, with the things we sense, and by supplementation, we can reach a kind of self-completion of thought. These are terms that Bradley uses, the notion of self-completion of thought, in order to get to the extremity of our thinking production, our thinking possibilities. As we'll learn later, there is a difficulty with the thinking process, which means that we have a disruption inside reality, which is the reason why we cannot have reality in thinking. In the production of ideas, in fact, we destroy something in the way reality is being shaped. And so doing, it's always very difficult to come up again and reach this kind of unity. In the self-completion of thought, in the process of supplementation, there's a limit unto which, as he says, we reach the suicide of thought. That is to say, there's a moment when, in fact, thought commits suicide if it wants to go beyond mere thinking. And it is where, in fact, feeling provides, in fact, what cannot be provided by thought. So, then we reach, I say, part 5, which continues this kind of explanation. But this absolute, it has been objected, is a mere blank or else unintelligible. Okay, so he has to explain how it can reach this. And he says, we start from the diversity in unity, which is given in feeling, a kind of infra-relational situation, and we develop this internally by the principle of self-completion beyond self, until we reach the idea of an all-inclusive and supra-relational experience. The last text Bradley wrote, which is entitled On Relations, which you can find in the collected works published in 1935, you have a more detailed explanation of the different stages, okay, the infra-relational moment, the relational way of thought, and then the supra-relational way of thinking. But here we have already this kind of strategy, so to say, that we can follow in order to provide this metaphysical statement. And this is something that it tries one more time to clarify in just a few sentences. Part 6, very small part, provide a few explanation about the absolute. The absolute must be one, because anything experienced is experienced in or as a whole, and the absolute is one system. Just to echo many parts in the books where it's being repeated, but he felt that it was important to deal with this before moving to the last 4 parts of the book, which are less important as far as we are concerned, because then we'll have to go to chapter 15. So at the beginning of chapter 15, Bradley explains it very quickly at the bottom of the first paragraph. In the present chapter, I'll try to state briefly the main essence of thought and to justify its distinction from actual existence. Reality contains 2 aspects. This is the that and the what, existence and content. I mean, this is pretty classic. This is the difference between the id quo and the id quod in scholastic philosophy. And so existence and content, and they are very important because they lead directly to the specificity of thought, which produces ideas. Okay, this is the objective of thought, to produce ideas all the time. But so doing, thought already discriminates between the that and the what. okay, separates things that normally shouldn't be kept separate. In reality, existence and content are not separated. It is thought which introduces, okay, thought which is the thinking process is discursive, is relational, and therefore it separates things that normally shouldn't be separated. Looks very much like something has been separated and we must, produce the unity back again. Basically, that's the whole movement. Okay, how is it possible, to reunite things that have been separated for the sake of commodity, and perhaps also because there is no other way? Because the human beings, are done in such a way that, they have a mind with a thinking process which provides a tool to understand the world around. But this tool isn't perfect. And therefore, there is a kind of quest for providing the thought that will exactly so yeah, I have to be very careful because you have different theories of truth that have been advanced to characterize Bradley's idea of truth. Okay, it is never truth coherence, never truth correspondence. It's always the identity theory of truth. It must be totally identical with it. So, okay, thought produces a lot of ideas, and it is the duty of judgment to reunite the things that have been separated. And therefore, Bradley uses this subject and predicate form of explanation, meaning that thought produces all what is necessary to supplement the predicate form. Okay, that say thought is essentially developing the what aspect of reality. And that they say separates the what from the that and tries to give as much of what as possible. I'll try to explain this as simply as possible. This is what he tries to do. So we have a disjunction of quality from being with the process of thought, and which means that thought cannot be the same as reality. So judgment tries to unite all this, and what is called truth is the situation. It's it's a property of the subject and predicate form when it is conform, which is in conformity. This is the adequation of the thing and thinking, adequatio re et intellectus, okay? The conformity of the description of the thing with the thing itself. So therefore, there is a kind of gradual movement inside ideality. This is the first part of the text when Bradley explains what is the nature of ideality, and that this nature of ideality is visible in the way judgment tried to provide a satisfactory statement about truth. So I think we can move pretty quickly to something which, to my eyes, is quite important, which is the question of the other to thought. There is this idea that the thinking process tries at some time to go beyond its own capacities, because there is always the idea that there is a beyond what thought can produce. And this is a problem, because people realize that they can't see the end of it. They can't see when they will finally produce the explanation that will be totally satisfactory. There is a need to go beyond all that. And it is here that the question of the other is important, because we can stop the process and say that it is impossible to go beyond. We can maintain a strictly transcendent position to this beyond and call it a thing in itself.
Mm-hmm.
Let's say there is a limit to the possibilities of knowledge. And there is no way we can do that, for sure. The fact is that Bradley was involved into a kind of intellectual controversy that was quite important in the second half of the 19th century. The Victorian age dealt with many sorts of controversies. And this is one which particularly affected the philosophical world. It has something to do with the way Kant was introduced in Britain from the early 19th century to the middle of the century. And the way Hamilton perceived Kant, which is an aberration from the German point of view, because he perceived Kant as a skeptic, which is not quite, the Kant I have in mind, but say that the thing itself is something that we can't reach. So therefore, it is a way to produce a very skeptical explanation over all philosophies, all systems of knowledge, because there is a kind of limit to all systems of knowledge. And you had other people like me who say, well, this is not a problem, actually. We are not that much interested in the unknowable, and we make as if the thing didn't exist because it's no interest for us. In fact, we are very much more interested in, the scientific discoveries that are actually transforming the world and producing another kind of reality in which we can trust. And there were quite a few important philosophical figures who came to coalesce around this notion of relativity of knowledge kind of controversy. Bradley produced texts on the relativity of knowledge. There are two texts, a big text which is entitled Relativity, and a second text which is meant to be a kind of clarification or introduction to the text Relativity, which is entitled The Relativity of Knowledge and Being. These texts are a kind of proto-metaphysical statement about the relativity of knowledge. When you read the text, you realize that a great deal of the whole thinking that we are dealing with here in this chapter is already at work. The problem is that Bradley at the time wasn't philosophically strong enough to develop this into a metaphysical doctrine. It is evident. Yet, what it did was it just used a few chunks of his text within the presupposition of critical history and also in ethical studies. And it was quite typical of his style at the time. Say, yes, but here you see we're moving towards the field of metaphysics. So it's not my intention to get into the field of metaphysics because we need a metaphysical doctrine before we can do it. So he always postponed the time when he would deal with that metaphysical question. At any rate, what he managed to do in both presupposition of critical history and ethical studies was to get rid of one part of the two camps in opposition in this controversy about the relative knowledge. Let's say he got rid of the empirical school, of the utilitarian, empirical and hedonic school. He's just got rid of it, especially in ethical studies. So what was left was the other camp. That is to say that highly depended on the idea of the thing in itself. It's no surprise that the end of chapter 15 precisely explains that the absolute is the philosophy that just makes the thing of itself useless. That is to say, what Bradley wanted to do, just like all the idealists, was to provide a statement that would go beyond what the two camps were defending. Let's say, providing the philosophy that would finally provide the final solution to the controversy. And this is exactly what Bradley did. Not only in this chapter 15, but also, in his book Appearance and Reality. So, you see, we can skip down to the end of chapter 15. You have the final sentences of chapter 15, which read, "The assertion of this absolute reality, I hope in the sequel to justify. Here, if I have not failed, I've shown that, at least from the point of view of thinking, it's free from self-contradiction. The justification for thought of another may help both to explain and to bury the thing in itself." Okay, the background of chapter 15 and the background of Appearance and Reality is the final settlement of the question of the relativity of knowledge, but here adopted from an idealist perspective and this other of thought. Now, perhaps we could end with just a word about this question of the other. As we indicated before, in this process of self-completion of thought, there was a moment when the thinking process was placed, from Bradley's perspective, in front of a choice to make. It was possible to go beyond the thinking process, but that would be what he says, thought suicide. Say, the idea of reconnecting that and the what, the predicate and the subject, would mean the end of thought. And how is it possible to do that? You can say, well, you believe in an unknowable and say, okay, this is the limit of our thought. But we know that this is the answer that Bradley didn't want to hear about. There is another possibility to mean that there is something which he calls the other of thought, which is present all the time, which is an imminent principle, which is the absolute, not the absolute truth, okay, but the absolute, which is forever present. And it has two particularities. It is, so this is what he says a little bit before. Okay. It has two special characters, sensuous infinitude and immediacy. It is at the same time immediate, and at the same time it is, a kind of immediate experience. It is something which is experience and something which is immediate. Okay, it is on page 176 in my edition. This is near the end, when precisely tries to when Bradley tries to characterize the other to thought. And so it has immediacy, and it is on the sensuous plane. So this is the doctrine of feeling. We know that Bradley was not completely satisfied with this doctrine of feeling, but here we have, his position. The other thought is at the same time transcendent, if we wish, because it's not in thought, but at the same time it's imminent. It's already there. It's constantly there. It's at an infra-relational position, so to speak. Okay, but it is there. One of my friends said, it was more than sorry. Instead of saying it is infra-relational, it should be better to say it was meta-relational. Which is perhaps a better way to make it. Okay, meta-relational situation. It's always present. It is complete presence. Okay, and the thinking process goes, all the time, runs through the different ideas that it produces from generation to generation, which gradually conceives different idiospheres or paradigms that are produced by the thinking process, but all the time that sensuous system is forever imminent and present and accompanies the thinking process. Which means there's still a possibility, to go beyond it, to seek for a supra-relational situation, a possibility of connection out of desires, because what we're looking for is a satisfaction. Okay, we should never forget this. Okay, and which will be the sign, because in chapter 24, when Bradley deals with the degrees of truth and reality, we have this final explanation. You say we sense that we are coming closer to reality when we are getting more satisfied with our explanation. Okay, so that is what we have in this chapter 15. And we see the final resolution of a problem that Bradley was confronted with at the time when he started his philosophical career, where finally he provided a final settlement, which at the same time provided a picture for this idealist movement could produce an idea on this relativity of knowledge. And so this is why, you see, I wanted to say that there was a way to get into appearance and reality that would start with the general introduction, the appendix, and then to chapter 15, because you have the core of Bradley's thinking. And then when we have this in mind, we can read the other chapters with a vantage point of knowing exactly, the foundation, and see how he adjusts his criticism of, ancient modes of thinking, and where he finally refines a certain amendment regarding the question of reality. It goes through the question of error, the question of evil. Very interesting question from Bradley's point of view, the question of goodness and so on. So this is what I wanted to start with. The 19th century is a kind of transitional century. In our civilization, understand the industrial civilization, the transforming power, the rise of science and technology and all that. But from a philosophical perspective, it was also transitional. Because, say, at the end of the 18th century, we had the critique of pure reason, which precisely, dealt with the thing in itself. And, say, in the 20th century, we'd have the Husserl's idea of a phenomenology. And between the two, you had the question of the relativity of knowledge that was very much discussed, with the idea that science was moving its own way, was transforming the whole world, was a very concrete approach to reality. And it was very efficient. It was very effective. And so how did the philosophers try, to respond to this? For some time, there was all this discussion about how far can we know about the reality, philosophically speaking. And we have to answer this question very quickly, because science and technology, the materialist forces, are providing their own answer, and they are pretty good at it. And until we realize after the First World War that, this big movement of science and progress was perhaps a dead end. After the First World War, there were lots of, discussion about, what's the true nature of progress after all? Is that a good idea to follow in that direction? And Husserl provided, with his phenomenology, his idea what was at stake was in fact the necessity to understand the structure of consciousness, because everything is in there. And hence, what you have, we have existentialism, we have different hermeneutic philosophies jumping from there. And if we compare, these two movements, Kant and Husserl, we see that Berkeley and some idealist philosophers had provided a solution all their own, which was distinct from both attempts, was just a structure of its own, and which perhaps, for this reason, had a validity of its own. A whole validity of its own. Now, it's a question whether you're satisfied with this solution, or if you are more an existentialist or an hermeneutist or a materialist or whatever, but still you have this philosophy that was very soon forgotten. It's one of the big problems of the British Idealist movement in the 20th century. It became very, very quickly abandoned and forgotten and neglected. Until 1980s, where people realized that after all, there was something, decently important here, that required, that we should have a look at it one more time. And this is how I would judge the importance of the British Idealist movement, and in Berlin in particular. There were many other idealist thinkers, but I think that Berkeley is perhaps the one who provided the most cogent and developed metaphysical doctrine of them all. And, it's very different from the others as well. He was very much a recluse and a very special kind of man. But I think that he incarnates somewhere the aspirations of this idealist movement.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I think on that note, we'll bring a very interesting discussion to a close. For anyone listening, if we've whet your appetite to look at the book more closely, obviously we've been focusing here on the bigger picture, some of the historical context and the questions Bradley's trying to answer and his approach. We haven't really tried to dive into the nuts and bolts and the push and pulls of the argument and how he tries to get there. But we do that when we discuss each chapter in turn. If you want to see those videos, you'll have to become a member of the channel. They're all available for all channel members starting at £3. Part of the reason why I've done that now is because when I produce these videos diving into specific chapters of works like by Bradley, etc., they don't really go viral. And so it actually starts to hurt my channel in terms of getting more traffic to the channel. So it was necessary for me to not make them public. But I do really want you to be able to listen to them. It's the stuff that I set the channel up to really jump into. So please do that. And we've got a few members and we'll see you over there. But otherwise, yes. Tell your friends if this stuff is interesting. Try to subscribe to the channel. I'll be doing more stuff on the channel that's public as well. But if you are able to support the channel, that'd be very helpful. It'll help me to do more of this kind of thing and to continue to put it out there. So once again, thank you very much for coming and talking to us, Professor Rosaye.
My pleasure.
And we're looking forward to discussing chapters with you as well in the future in our membership area.
Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.